Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Matt Bowen. I'm a research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Let me first quickly say that this event is being webcast live and full video will be available online in the coming days. Today, we're going to be discussing the Nuclear Suppliers Group, a group of countries committed to the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, who maintain two lists of items to be controlled and who have committed themselves to adhere to the export guidelines that apply to each list. We'll be discussing the group's past activities to better understand how we got to where we are today, and then current policy issues, as well as implications for the group in a world where nuclear energy usage may rise as part of efforts to address climate change. First, I'd like to introduce Eliot Kang, the Acting Assistant Secretary for International Security and Nonproliferation at the US State Department. He has served in a variety of roles at state in the past, including Deputy Assistant Secretary for Threat Reduction, Export Controls and Negotiations, and Special Advisor for North Korean denuclearization. He will provide us with some opening remarks before we move to the panel discussions. Assistant Secretary Kang.
Great, thank you, Matt, for the introduction and inviting me here today. It's a great pleasure to be here and kicking off what I know will be a fascinating discussion by some of the foremost experts on the Nuclear Supplier Group and its operation. While today's distinguished panelists will go in depth about some of the more nuanced aspects of the NSG, I'd like to first set the scene for the role that it plays in the world. Although it's critical to non-proliferation, the NSG's role is often overlooked. At the State Department's Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation, my team and I are tasked with preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction, conventional weapons, their delivery systems, and dual-use technologies. Naturally, a significant portion of this work revolves on nuclear non-proliferation. To do our job effectively, we engage regularly with partners around the world, including through multilateral fora like the NSG. No one country can single-handedly prevent this kind of proliferation, and the threat of nuclear weapons is one that impacts all of us. That means we must work together in order to achieve our dual objective of preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons, while at the same time facilitating legitimate trade and cooperation for peaceful purposes. Through the NSG, nuclear supplier countries set common guidelines and establish export control lists, which participating countries then apply to their own peaceful nuclear and nuclear-related exports. This allows legitimate trade and collaboration to continue without the risk would-be proliferators accessing the material, equipment, and technology needed to build nuclear weapons or explosive devices. Such guidelines also reinforce two other key elements of the nuclear non-proliferation regime: the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the International Atomic Energy Agency's safeguard system. The need to safely facilitate this kind of international cooperation has never been more important than it is today. The world is facing an unprecedented climate crisis. It is imperative that we increase access to clean, reliable energy sources, including nuclear energy, as quickly as possible. But we need to make sure that this is done safely and securely while abiding by the highest non-proliferation standards. If we are to accomplish this, we will need to find that careful balance between minimizing nuclear proliferation risk and maximizing access to peaceful uses. Finding and maintaining this balance will rely heavily upon the NSG. However, we're also in a time of incredible technological and market transformation. New nuclear technologies are emerging, including advanced reactor technologies. While such technologies may offer opportunities to decarbonize the global economy, they also include new materials and equipment that pose proliferation risks. With these innovations, as well as innovations in manufacturing and commerce, comes the responsibility to be forward-looking and to ensure that emerging and advanced nuclear technologies are properly addressed in the NSG's guidelines and control lists. Doing so will require significant, sustained, and collaborative effort on the part of all NSG participating governments, not unlike the effort 30 years ago to create the NSG's dual-use list. It will also require us to work more closely with our industry and scientific partners. After all, they're the ones who are developing and seeking to commercialize these new technologies. And they are the partners we in government rely on to execute our export control policies. That is why the United States is such a strong proponent of outreach to industry by the NSG and its participating governments. It is also why we are currently conducting studies to better understand developments in advanced reactor technology and sharing our insight with the NSG. We encourage other NSG governments to make similar contributions to this effort and to support bringing India into the group. It is also involved in the development of advanced reactors. The more knowledge we can gain, the better informed we will be in updating the rules and guidelines we rely on. The NSG will remain an integral component of the global non-proliferation regime. All participating governments share a responsibility to ensure that it has the capacity to fulfill its obligations while keeping pace with the 21st century challenges. We all benefit when we have clear, effective, and up-to-date export controls and guidelines. They play a critical role to make our world safer. With that, I'll turn it back to Matt and over to our distinguished panelists. I can think of no better group to dive into these important issues, one gathered here today. And thank you so much for this opportunity to be part of the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary, for those remarks. We will now have two panels of experts from around the world who have carried out roles within the NSG in the past and can provide us with some great perspective on both historical developments and present-day policy questions facing the group. So we'll kind of be looking both backward and forward at various times today. And for reasons of time, I'm going to keep the panelists' lengthy bios relatively short. For our first panel, we have Ambassador Piet Klerk, a Dutch diplomat who worked most of his career for the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was Director of Policy Coordination and External Relations of the International Atomic Energy Agency from 1998 to 2003. He chaired the Nuclear Suppliers Group from 2011 to 2012, and he also chaired one of the other multilateral export control groups, the Missile Technology Control Regime, from 2015 to 2016. Jim Casterton is a consultant who has held senior positions in the Canadian government, implementing the country's nuclear cooperation agreements, administering export control regulations, and implementing Canada's safeguards agreement with the IAEA. Most relevant to today's discussion, he chaired the dual-use consultations back in the 1990s and thus is in a great position to talk a bit about the creation of the dual-use list. Kazuko Hikawa is a professor of Graduate School of International Collaboration and Coexistence in the 21st century of Osaka Jogakuin University in Japan. Before she joined academia, she had served as a diplomat with the Japanese Foreign Service for 24 years, working in particular on issues of disarmament and non-proliferation. Relevant to today's discussion, she was a member of the NSG Point of Contact and therefore well positioned to explain how the NSG operates. I'm going to ask each panelist to give some remarks on different topics before we move to Q&A. We'll hear from Ambassador de Klerk first on the early years of the NSG and its revitalization and subsequent policy developments related to the trigger list. Ambassador de Klerk.
Thank you very much, Matt. And it's a great pleasure to be in this company of friends and colleagues whom I haven't seen for too long. I intend to make 3 points. First, on the start of the NSG, although I was not present at the creation. Then go to the revitalization of the NSG in the fall of 1990. And then make a few points about that meeting, that first meeting after the revitalization in The Hague in the spring of 1991. As to the first point, it was Henry Kissinger who was present at the creation. Who else? To be more precise, he was the one who launched the proposal for creating a group of countries that would establish practical controls on the transfer of nuclear materials. The launch date was 23 September 1974, and the venue was the annual ministerial meeting in New York of the UN. Kissinger's speech had a number of important nuclear points, one that led to the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, but all his speech, or most of his speech, was a direct consequence of the Indian peaceful explosion in May that year, a few months before. As a result of that American initiative, in the fall, the United States circulated an aide-memoire with 5 key points. One is exports only to non-nuclear weapon states that forswear nuclear explosive devices. 2, IAEA inspections to cover supplies and subsequently produce nuclear material. 3, special restraints for exporting weapon-grade nuclear material, reprocessing and enrichment technology. 4, suitable measures in recipient countries for protection against theft, seizure, and sabotage. And 5, and last, strict conditions to potentially unstable or conflict-ridden countries and regions. Now, Kissinger had instructed the staff of the State Department. He was, since a year, he was the Secretary of State. And that small group consisted of Canada, France, Germany, West Germany at the time, Japan, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom. And of special importance was France, because it was the only country in the group that was not an NPT country yet. And France was also the country who was most outside of that group in terms of policy. And that's why President Ford at the time invited the French President Giscard d'Estaing to, or maybe the other way around, Giscard invited Ford to Martinique to discuss the issue, and that didn't really resolve it, but it led to a compromise that France would also attend meetings in the month after that, but in listening mode. So that group met a few times in London, and that's why originally it was called the London Suppliers Group. And the special stumbling block was the special restraint clause. The question was, what does that mean precisely? And France had quite an interest because it had large reprocessing deals with Korea and Pakistan. And full scope safeguards for everything, every export as a condition of supply was clearly a bridge too far for the French, who had a certain distrust against this American initiative, like the Germans had, that it would steal their nuclear business, because both were very active in the nuclear export business. But a compromise was found, in particular between France and Canada, who was very much in favor of very strict export conditions, because Canada also had a role when it came to the Indian peaceful explosion, because Canada also had exported some of the relevant materials that led to, that enabled the Indians to have that peaceful explosion. But so there was a compromise that sensitive exports would require IAEA safeguards, and that, of course, was a new commitment for the French, because, as I said, France was not a member of the NPT yet. So it was early 1976 that there was an agreement on a set of guidelines within that group of 1996. And they also agreed on the list of nuclear items that would trigger the safeguards, and hence it's called the trigger list. A few months later, the group was expanded by a number of other countries, including the Netherlands, 7 other countries that came on board in March of 1976. And the 13 states together made their agreement public in 1978 in a series of letters that were sent to the IAEA Director General. All right, fast forward to 1990. When Iraq had become a problem, not only because it was invading Kuwait, but also because it had a somewhat suspect nuclear program. In the 1970s, it had bought a few reactors from France and a reprocessing facility from the Italians. And some of the choices made by the Iraqis and some of their wishes were troublesome. And in retrospect, it seems clear that somewhere in 1980, close to the start of the Iran-Iraq war, Saddam, then vice president, decided that Iraq needed a nuclear weapons capability. That led in 1981, June 1981, to the Israeli bombarding of the Tammuz reactor before it became critical. And in retrospect, it seems clear that it was after that instruction by Saddam had been handed down to his staff, but it was also before other Israeli actions in France is still to some extent an open question. So that bombardment led to Israel was criticized all around. But for a number of years, nothing happened in Iraq on the nuclear front. But that started to change in the second half of the 80s, when a number of imports by Iraq, nuclear and dual use imports, raised the questions again. I remember, for example, an export of maraging steel that slipped through the net in the Netherlands. And other shipments also slipped through or were not recognized as nuclear related, like valves, bearings, cameras, high-speed cameras. And if they were, the possibilities for states to do anything about it were limited because dual-use goods were not under any form of export control. In the light of the NPT review conference that took place in that year, 1980, and decided to, or had found consensus on better safeguards and better export coordination, including, for the first time, the support for full scope safeguards. There was a consensus in main committee 2 of the review conference. Unfortunately, that review conference as a whole didn't come to a consensus on a final document. But with that implicit agreement, the American delegation, the US delegation in Vienna, approached the Dutch mission in Vienna, where I worked at the time, in the fall with the question whether we would be prepared to host again a meeting of the nuclear suppliers group in the Netherlands in light of that implicit mandate given by the review conference. I should add that between 1976 and 1991, there were no meetings of the nuclear suppliers group. There was not really a strict need, and the French were also against it. So that was my second point, how that revitalization of the nuclear suppliers group came about, because we, after some back and forth with The Hague, said yes to that American request and organized a meeting in March 1991 in the Foreign Ministry in The Hague. Now, my third and last point, what did that meeting achieve? There were three main issues on the agenda. To update the trigger list in the light of developments in the field of nuclear technology. B, the question of making the acceptance of full scope safeguards a condition of supply, so safeguards on all nuclear installations in the destination country. And C, the question of introducing controls on dual use technology in the field of nuclear technology, because that was the lesson of Iraq. On that first point, harmonization of the trigger list. In the meantime, the body that existed under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the trigger list of the Zanger Committee had evolved further. And the question was, how should the nuclear supplier group relate to that? It had a trigger list of its own, but it needed to be harmonized with the trigger list of the Zanger Committee. And at the meeting in The Hague in the spring of 1991, the Finns had written a paper on that, on the differences and on harmonization, and it was agreed at the meeting that they would do that work in the course of the year. On full scope safeguards, as I said, there was consensus about that condition of supply at the NPT review conference. France was not yet an NPT party at the time. And there was not an immediate decision at the meeting in The Hague to have that condition of supply, but the meeting set in motion a process that led to agreement in Warsaw the year after. And that declaration of the Warsaw meeting resulted in an IAEA document, IMSIC 405, where that is laid down. And the only exception was that when a certain export was necessary for the safe operation of a nuclear installation, then you could do away with that condition of full scope safeguard. So if you would want to export something for safety reasons to, say, India, that you might get dispensation for doing that. And finally, dual use, also a very complex issue. The Americans had written a paper on dual use goods, referring to that NPT review conference where controlling dual use exports was recognized as a growing problem. But plugging the dual use hole would require a consensus on quite a number of things, on the commodities to be controlled, on the basic principles involved, the guidelines and definitions for assessing proposed transfers. So that American paper made a start with that, but it was clear that it was too complex to decide in one meeting. So the meeting in The Hague created a working group led by a number of American experts that traveled from one energy country to the other in the year between the meetings in the Netherlands and Warsaw. And that led to a full agreement in Warsaw the year after, and that agreement was published in September 1992. So in conclusion, I would say that the meeting in The Hague as a starting point and the meeting in Warsaw as the end point of these three important developments were perhaps the most important and most consequential meetings of the NSG ever. And the structure that was achieved then is still the backbone structure of the NSG today. So with that, I would like to give the floor back to Matt. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador de Klerk, for that perspective. And that's a great point for our next panelist, Jim Casterton, to talk about the creation of the dual use list.
Thank you, Matt. And thanks to the Center for Global Energy Policy for the invitation to be part of this initiative. I'm sure that the discussion today, as Assistant Secretary Kang said, will will be very interesting and very useful. I'm pleased to be on the panel with Ambassador de Klerk, whom I have known for many years. He is a fine example of the skilled and knowledgeable professionals that the Netherlands have contributed to so much of the evolution of the NSG in particular, but also in non-proliferation. I would also like to acknowledge Kazuko Hikawa's contribution in addressing non-proliferation and disarmament issues, and I commend her for her service as a member of the NSG point of contact. I believe my role today is to provide a few observations on the origins of the Part 2 of the NSG guidelines, commonly referred to as the dual use list. And I intend to do so primarily from the perspective of one of the negotiators of the dual use guidelines, Annex and MOU, and as chair of the dual use consultation from October 1996 to March 1998. Ambassador de Klerk has so elegantly identified some of the political issues that surrounded this period of time. I will be more into the nuts and bolts and of my perception of what went on. For example, I'm of the view that there was not one definitive event that led to the creation of the dual use guidelines. Rather, there were a number of factors that collectively set the stage for an agreement on a multilateral mechanism to govern the export of nuclear-related dual-use goods. Now, before discussing the factors, let's ensure we have a common understanding of what that term dual-use means in the context of the NSG. Originally, the term referred to items that could make a major contribution to an unsafeguarded nuclear fuel cycle activity or to a nuclear explosive activity, but that could also have non-nuclear or non-explosive use. These items include equipment, material, software, related technology. I note that the original definition was adjusted in 2002 to indicate that the items on the dual use list could also make a major contribution to acts of nuclear terrorism. In examining some of the factors that influence the development of the dual use mechanism, I will start with something that might not be obvious, and that is the Zanger Committee. As you know, the Zanger Committee was formed soon after the NPT came into force to interpret Article 3.2 of the NPT. The original Zanger list of items identified nuclear fuel cycle facilities, and in a very superficial sense, equipment especially designed and prepared therefor. Now, I say superficial because there were no specific equipment items identified on the list. However, in the early 1980s and the early 1990s, the Zanger Committee undertook several initiatives to clarify what should be considered as especially designed or prepared equipment for gaseous diffusion enrichment, for reprocessing, for gas centrifuge enrichment, and for heavy water production. This flurry of activity involving consultation and negotiation among the various technology holders covered a wide range of technologies over a relatively short period of time and had three positive effects on the subsequent creation of the dual use mechanism. First, it created an environment of cooperation amongst the members of the Zanger Committee, certainly at the technical level, but also on a policy level. Second, it clarified items that are considered to be especially designed or prepared. In doing so unwittingly, it provided a useful context to the significant and controllable criteria subsequently used to develop the dual use list. A number of items were identified as being relevant to proliferation from a proliferation perspective, but that didn't qualify as especially designed or prepared. So these items were not included on the Zanger list. Rather, they were considered as dual use items, that is, multi-purpose items, and suppliers were urged to make best efforts to control the export of them. This informal approach to export control was not effective, as many of the members of the Laggner Committee did not have national laws or regulations to implement such control. A second factor that, in my view, influenced the development of the dual use mechanism has already been mentioned by Piet, but it was the NPT review conference process. At the 1990 NPT review conference, as Ambassador Klerk mentioned, the results of the deliberation of Committee 2 included a number of recommendations to strengthen the nuclear non-proliferation regime. This included a recommendation that states engage in consultations to ensure appropriate coordination of their controls on the export of items such as tritium not identified in Article 3.2, but still relevant to nuclear weapons proliferation and therefore to the NPT as a whole. As pointed out, the 1990 NPT review conference did not reach consensus on a final document. However, the recommendation from Committee 2 reflected a growing awareness among states party of the importance of nuclear-related dual-use items and of multilateral cooperation in ensuring appropriate controls on the export of such items. A third factor, as mentioned, was the Gulf War and the subsequent discovery of the Iraqi nuclear weapons program, which to a great extent had relied on the import of nuclear-related dual-use items from various suppliers. This development certainly helped to increase the focus on the importance of controlling the export of nuclear-related dual-use items and demonstrated the urgency in addressing the issue. Finally, the fourth factor that was instrumental in the creation of the dual-use guidelines was not an event, nor was it a circumstance. It was the professionalism, dedication, steadfastness, approachability, and unsurmountable decency of a person called Carl Thorne. Early in 1990, prior to the beginning of the Gulf War, the US initiated informal discussions with supplier states to gauge their interest in establishing multilateral controls on the export of nuclear-related dual-use items and on reconstituting the NSG as a mechanism to embody these controls. Carl played a major role in this effort. He also chaired an informal meeting of the states adhering to the NSG in February 1991, at which working drafts of both dual-use guidelines and a list of items to be controlled were presented. Ambassador Klerk pointed out that at the meeting of the adherence to the NSG guidelines held in The Hague in March 1991, the dual-use working group was created to pursue efforts to establish an appropriate arrangement. To no one's surprise, Carl became chair of that working group. The working group held 4 meetings over 9 months, from April 1991 to January 1992. And at those meetings, under Carl's guidance, a set of guidelines, a memorandum of understanding outlining procedures for the implementation of the guidelines, and a list of nuclear-related dual-use items to be controlled were negotiated and received ad referendum agreement. They were formally adopted at the meeting of adherence to the NSG guidelines held in Warsaw in April 1992. This was undoubtedly a tremendous accomplishment, which was a product of Carl's skill, as well as the constructive cooperation, openness, and sense of common purpose that characterized the meetings. Now, the negotiation of the dual-use guidelines annex and the MOU resulted in agreement on some significant provisions that were ultimately incorporated into the NSG Part 1 guidelines at a later date. The dual-use guidelines contained what is referred to as the basic principle, which states that suppliers should not transfer any items in the annex if it would be contrary to the objective of averting the proliferation of nuclear weapons. This was later modified to also include a reference to nuclear terrorism. A similar provision, referred to as the Non-Proliferation Principle, was added to the Part 1 guidelines in 1994. In addition, the Part 2 Annex included controls on the transfer of technology required for the development, production, and use of any item contained in the Annex. Technology controls were incorporated into the Part 1 guideline in 1995. So let me conclude by way of a couple of final observations. There have been a number of changes since the dual-use guidelines were originally created, including changes to how they fit into the NSG's operational or procedural structure. However, the dual-use guidelines continue to perform a vital function in the pursuit of nuclear proliferation or nuclear non-proliferation. They provide the basis for multilaterally agreed controls on the export of items of proliferation significance that are not controlled by any other mechanism. Now, I recognize that the world we live in today is not the world of the 1980s or the 1990s, and that the current environment presents many challenges both inside and outside the NSG framework that will ultimately impact the continued evolution of the NSG. However, I suspect that progress in strengthening the Part 2 guidelines as well as the Part 1 guidelines in order to address new proliferation challenges will require a return to the environment of strong leadership, constructive cooperation, and a sense of common purpose that characterized the original effort. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Jim. And now we'll hear from Kazuko Hikawa on some of the institutional aspects of the NSG.
Sorry, it was muted. Thank you, Matt, for having me today. And thank you, Mr. Casterton, for your kind words. I'm very honored to be able to participate in this webinar today and to talk about the institutional aspect of the NSG. There are 4 important institutional arrangements for the NSG, which I would like to touch upon today. The POC, host country of the NSG plenary, NIS, and the NSG website. Let me first start with the POC. Any organization or forum needs to have a system to support logistics, to get together, hold discussions, hold meetings, produce documents, and function as a group. Such a system is usually called a secretariat. But as you may know, the NSG does not have a formal secretariat. Instead, it has a point of contact, the POC. And the POC provides the NSG participating governments with a practical support function like a secretariat does in other organizations. The POC was established in 1992 after the 1992 NSG plenary in Warsaw accepted the offer from the Japanese government to serve as a point of contact through its permanent mission to the international organization in Vienna for administering nuclear-related dual-use arrangement, and it expanded its work to administer Part 1 guidelines after the decision of the 1995 NSG plenary in Helsinki to strengthen the POC. So what the POC is actually doing? The POC receives and distributes NSG documents on a daily basis, notifies meeting schedules, maintains the official records, and provides logistical and practical assistance to the chair of the plenary, the chair of the CZ, the chair of the IEM, and the chairs of technical meetings such as LIM and TEC. In the POC, we have full-time staff to do this work, together with some diplomats assigned to supervise them. One thing I would like to note here is that the diplomats change as they are transferred every 2 to 3 years. But the full-time staff stays the same usually. Some left, but usually they stays the same. So in order to maintain the institutional memory as a POC, the role of the full-time staff is significant and their commitment is also needed. It is important that they truly love the NSG and they are highly motivated to do their work. And in fact, the POC staff is committed to this. And as a former Japanese diplomat who worked together with them in the past in the POC, I really would like to commend them for their tireless work and commitment. In terms of institutional aspect, the role of the host country of the NSG plenary is also important. It plays an important role in functionally supporting the activities of the NSG. The chair of the NSG is elected by consensus of the NSG participating governments and basically changes every year. And the country that nominates the NSG chair will support the activities of the NSG for at least 1 year as the host country of the NSG plenary. But considering that the chair of the NSG will continue to serve as a member of the Troika and will be responsible for NSG outreach and other activities after his term as the chair ends, the duties of the host country of the NSG plenary will not end in 1 year. The host country of the NSG plenary will not only provide the NSG chair, but also the chairs of IEM, LIM, and their assistants as a team. Of course, the host country will also be responsible for the selection of the location and all necessary arrangements for the week-long plenary and related meetings. I have attended 8 NSG plenary meetings in the past. What I strongly felt from that experience is that for the NSG to function well, close cooperation and coordination between the POC and the host country is necessary. So the host country changes every year, but the POC is a standing function that supports and maintains the institutional memory of the NSG. In this sense, I think that the POC needs to support the host country in a sense as a back of wisdom and to be prepared to support the host country in any way and at any time when necessary. Finally, as the NSG does not have a general budget, NSG participating governments are voluntarily making various in-kind contributions. The POC is one example offered by Japan, but other countries are also contributing to the group's operation in other ways. For example, the United States is responsible for NSG information sharing system, NIS, called NIS. So without NIS, there would be no secure information sharing or communication possible at the NSG. The United States has also provided the CG chair for many years. I don't remember exactly how many years, but I feel like forever, that legend CG chair, Mr. Grubich, has been always there as a CG chair. So Germany, through its Federal Office for Economic Affairs and Export Control, is responsible for hosting the NSG public website, sponsored technically by the European Commission's Joint Research Center in Italy. The creation of a website was agreed at the 2001 NSG plenary in Aspen in order to better inform public of the role and activities of the NSG. The website has been refined and restructured since 2013, launched in multiple languages, and it has now frequently asked questions section and even an explanatory video about the NSG. To conclude, the NSG is a group institutionally supported by the voluntary contributions and engagement of participating governments to achieve its mission of export control that does not interfere with trade in nuclear industry while ensuring nuclear non-proliferation. I also would like to say that at the end, I do hope that the Japanese government will continue to contribute to the NSG, among others, through the POC and support the work of the POC. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kazuko. We are running a little bit behind schedule, so I think what I'm going to do is ask each panelist a question, ask that they keep their responses to 2, maybe no more than 3 minutes before we move on to the next panel. And for those of you who have joined us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking the Q&A button. For those of you watching live stream on Facebook, you can submit a question there. And you can also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CJEPLive and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy. So Ambassador de Klerk, the Nuclear Suppliers Group has had some criticism over the years, and in particular, one charge that it acts like a cartel. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that viewpoint.
Yeah, I think indeed it was often referred to as a cartel. And it was also clear that the NSG was controversial, and in particular because of the word restraint, which in practice meant denial of sensitive technologies like enrichment and reprocessing technologies. So controversy, yes, but I think the word cartel is inappropriate because the cartel is a group of companies who, on the basis of secret arrangements, try to push competitors out of the market. Now, if you're sitting, say, in India, you can see the NSG as a group of states trying to prevent another state from becoming a nuclear weapon state. And of course, there's no God-given rule that that state could not become a nuclear weapon state. But I think the key difference is that normally when you speak of cartels, that's being done on the basis of secret arrangements. Whereas here, what the NSG did was taking the non-proliferation objectives as laid down in the NPT seriously, and in all openness, trying to say, this is what we are standing for. These are our rules, and they are public. And the funny thing is that a country like India was against it, I understand, but that so many other states that had full scope safeguards in the first place were also riding along in that protest movement. That's more difficult to explain. But so anyway, the short answer is I think the cartel etiquette is not very appropriate.
Okay, thank you. And Jim, the Assistant Secretary talked a little bit about nuclear energy and changes in technology. I'm wondering if you could speak to what developments or potential developments you see in the civil nuclear energy field that could have potentially impacts on the NSG control list going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yes, I did note the Acting Assistant Secretary Kang pointed out the challenges inherent in technological advances as we seek to pursue nuclear energy in a low carbon world. I mean, obviously for me, as we look at innovative approaches, whether we call them advanced reactors, whether we call them small modular reactors or small medium-sized reactors, I think that there's a lot of work going on globally in this area. And it, without prejudice to the outcome, it may create opportunities or necessity for the NSG to examine the various items of equipment, technology, or material, for instance, unique fuels and so on and so forth, that may not be covered from an export control perspective within the NSG guidelines, but which may be of proliferation significance. So I can see that as being fertile ground for future discussion within the NSG, whether we're talking about EDP equipment or dual use equipment. But I also agree that, as I mentioned, and I think as others have mentioned, there has to be sort of there has to be definitely a cooperative approach in order to have this discussion lead to controls that may be necessary in order to advance the non-proliferation objectives.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Kazuko, the IAEA has had this kind of dual role of assisting member states in the use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, and also verifying that nations are complying with their commitments under the Non-Proliferation Treaty through the application of safeguards. So we've always had this kind of connection to IAEA safeguards and the NSG trigger list guidelines. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that connection, both in the past and potentially in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent questions. I would like to point out two things. There is no doubt that there is a close interdependence between IAEA safeguards and the NSG guidelines, as it's repeatedly stated in NSG documents. On the other hand, we should not forget that the NSG, while closely related to the NPT and the IAEA safeguards required by the NPT, is an independent system from the NPT itself and establishes separate and independent guidelines, which are used to coordinate international export control of nuclear materials, equipment, and related technologies among NSG participating governments for the purpose of the nuclear non-proliferation. This is precisely the difference between the NSG and the Zanga Committee, whose main task is to interpret Article 3, Section 2 of the NPT. In this sense, I believe that the revisions of the paragraph 6 and 9 of Part 1 guidelines at the NSG plenary in June 2011 are a good example of how the NSG has established rules on export control based on its own evaluation apart from IAEA safeguards. Why it is good? It's because the IAEA and the NSG have different objectives in the first place, and the activities that the NSG must deal with are not nuclear activities that are accumulated over several months, but export activities that are carried out on a daily basis. There is a practical need to prevent exports that could lead to nuclear non-proliferation. So I think that the interdependence between the IAEA and the NSG is important, but still NSG can keep their own evaluation and be creative and flexible. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Kazuko. And I think we're going to need to move to our second panel now. So I want to thank the speakers from our first panel. Thank you all. And we'll move to our second panel now. So we have three distinguished folks. Ambassador Benno Laggner is a Swiss career diplomat. He is currently the resident representative of Switzerland to the IAEA, represents Switzerland as governor on the IAEA Board of Governors, and as permanent representative to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization Preparatory Commission. He chaired the NSG from 2017 to 2018. Ambassador Georgie Zanetti is a Hungarian diplomat who joined the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in 1980, and she has represented Hungary at the IAEA, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and other organizations. She chaired the Hague Code of Conduct in 2008 and chaired the Nuclear Suppliers Group, starting with the plenary in Budapest in 2009. She was appointed the head of delegation of the European Union to the international organizations in Vienna in 2011. In that capacity, she represented the EU, including priorities such as non-proliferation. Finally, Ambassador Veronika Kuchanova-Smigolova is the Junior Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and Director of the Department of American States for the Czech Republic. She has served as the ambassador of the Czech Republic to Egypt and head of the permanent mission to the UN and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in Vienna. She chaired the Nuclear Suppliers Group starting in 2013 with the plenary in Prague, which I was actually present for as part of the US delegation. So we'll hear from Ambassador Laggner first on the topic of membership in the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Ambassador Laggner.
Thank you, Matt. And it's really a great pleasure to be on the panel with so many distinguished colleagues. And I just want to mention at the beginning that I'm speaking in a strictly personal capacity. I've been asked to speak on the issue of membership. I will structure my remarks in three parts. First, some general remarks. Then I will address two major challenges with regard to membership. And finally, a few words on what to do next. Some general remarks. Currently, the NSG has 48 members, or as they are called, participating governments, PGs. The last PG to join was Serbia in 2013. 4 states have formally submitted applications for membership: India, Pakistan, Jordan, and Namibia. Of these, the application by India has generated the most discussion. There was a push by some members of the group to have a decision taken on India's application at the Seoul plenary in 2016. However, there was no consensus, and I'll come back to this later. The NSG has agreed that when dealing with membership applications, 5 so-called factors, among others, should be taken into consideration. 3 of them are export control specific. A new PG should be able to supply items covered by the annexes to parts 1 and 2 of the guidelines. Should also adhere to and act in accordance with the guidelines, and this is done by sending an official communication to the Director General of the IAEA, which is then circulated as an INFCIRC document, and should have in force a legally based effective domestic export control system. 2 additional factors are of a political nature. A new PG should be a party to the NPT, or one of the 5 regional nuclear weapon-free zones, or an equivalent international nuclear non-proliferation agreement. And finally, a new PG should be supportive of international efforts towards the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and of their delivery vehicles. Now, the word factors already indicates that these are not necessarily to be understood as a rigid set of conditions. Whether all of these factors have to be fulfilled in a cumulative manner, as well as the precise scope of some of them, is open to interpretation. The factors are also not the only determining element. The wording, factors among others, already indicates that other considerations, such as political judgments, may enter into play. One thing, however, is clear. As decision-making in the NSG is by consensus, consensus is a condition for accepting a new PG. I would now like to highlight 2 major challenges with regard to the membership issue. First, the challenge of keeping the group at a manageable size. In order to be effective as an export control regime, the group should ideally include all relevant suppliers of nuclear and of nuclear-related dual-use items and technology. The NSG has had in the past an open-door policy. Expanding the membership, however, has an impact on the institutional effectiveness and practical functioning of the group. Adding more members could make decision-making, which is by consensus, more cumbersome and difficult. The NSG is already, in terms of membership, the largest of the export control regimes. It could also be a challenge for maintaining a certain degree of like-mindedness among the members of the group. But there are also practical aspects. With the exception of the plenary, the group meets in Vienna in premises made available by the permanent mission of Japan in its role as the point of contact, as we have already heard. Already at 48, the meeting room is crowded. The challenge, therefore, is to find the right balance between including all relevant countries and, on the other hand, preserving the like-mindedness of the group, as well as the efficiency and effectiveness of its decision-making. The second major challenge is the complex issue whether to accept non-NPT states as members. One of the political factors to be taken into account implies that PGs have to be parties to the NPT. It does mention as possible alternatives to the NPT requirement, being a party to one of the 5 regional nuclear weapon-free zones or to an equivalent international nuclear non-proliferation agreement. But these are not realistic alternatives. Taking the case of both India and Pakistan as non-NPT applicants, they, as nuclear armed states, of course, cannot join a nuclear weapon-free zone. And there is no other international nuclear non-proliferation agreement that could be considered as equivalent to the NPT. The other political factor mentions, in addition, commitment to non-proliferation in general terms and being supportive of international non-proliferation efforts. It doesn't go into more detail on this. An example for an important nuclear non-proliferation instrument is the CTBT. All current NSGPGs are either signatories to or have ratified the CTBT. This is not the case for India and Pakistan. Against this background, how should the issue of applications for membership by non-NPT states be approached? There are basically 3 options. One would be to interpret the NPT requirement in a strict and rigid manner. This would, of course, then exclude non-NPT states from membership. It would, however, also run counter to the interest to have all major nuclear technology holders included in the regime. At the other end of the spectrum would be the option to disregard the NPT requirement. This would, however, discriminate against the current NSG PGs, who are all parties to the NPT and, in addition, at least signatories to the CTBT, with corresponding obligations. It would also be perceived by many as weakening the global non-proliferation regime. The third, and in my view, only realistic option, is an approach that is both pragmatic and principled. Pragmatic in the sense that it is unrealistic to expect that any of the non-NPT states which seek membership in the NSG at present, India and Pakistan, or may do so in the future, possibly Israel, will join the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states. Nor will NPT states parties agree to amend Article 9, Paragraph 3 of the treaty. Principled in the sense that while recognizing the continued non-NPT status, this should be compensated by concrete commitments in some other form in order to strengthen the global non-proliferation regime. As there is more than one application from non-NPT states, an exception-based approach for only one of the applicants does not seem feasible. The group should therefore agree on non-discriminatory criteria applicable to all non-NPT states that would ensure common commitments and obligations with respect to the objectives and principles of the NPT and CTBT. These commitments would place the non-NPT applicants on a comparable footing with regard to the commitments of the current PGs. As already mentioned, there was no consensus on India's application at the Seoul plenary. The plenary decided to include a new agenda item for discussion entitled Technical, Legal and Political Aspects of the Participation of Non-NPT States in the NSG. The plenary chair asked his predecessor to act as a facilitator and conduct intersessional consultations after the Seoul plenary. Intensive consultations took place in various formats. The result was captured in a document in December 2016 without consensus being reached. While many PGs were satisfied with the document, Others argued that their concerns had not been fully taken into account, and there was an objection by a PG to the manner in which the process had been conducted. When I assumed the chairmanship of the group in 2017, it was obvious to me that there was a need to undertake a fresh start and resume the discussion in a manner acceptable to all, as well as in a transparent and inclusive setting. As announced at the Bern plenary, I organized 2 informal meetings on the margins of consultative group meetings in November 2017 and in April 2018 to provide an opportunity to all PGs to give their views on the issue, and I also encouraged them to address a number of specific questions. The 2 informal meetings showed that views continued to diverge considerably among PGs and that further discussions would be needed. Since April 2018, however, there have been no more informal discussions on this issue. Finally, what next? It is clear that at present, no decision is imminent on any of the current membership applications. This would therefore give the group some breathing space to discuss the different aspects of the membership issue in a more comprehensive and strategic manner. As we are just a few years from the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the NSG, this is the right time to start such a discussion. This could be done either in an informal, standalone process or as part of a broader reflection on the future institutional aspects for the NSG. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Laggner. Okay, now we'll hear from Ambassador Zanetti on the NSG's outreach programs.
Thank you very much, Matt. Let me start with welcoming the initiative of the Center and emphasize the timeliness of the subject in the context of global strive for a low carbon neutral world, but also to put it in the context of the upcoming review conference of the Treaty on Non-Proliferation. I'm very happy to join this excellent group of speakers and also the audience, and my best regards to all friends and colleagues amongst the speakers. I'd like to say a few words on the energy outreach activities, what it is the rationale behind, how it developed, and what was the Hungarian chairmanship contribution to it in 2009 and 2010. I'm also very glad to see in the current chairman's program, Special Envoy Lekarski emphasized the importance of outreach in his program. What are the declared aims of outreach activities by the NSG? To promote both adherence to the NSG guidelines and a greater understanding of the role, mission, and work of the NSG. The NSG is prepared to support efforts by non-PGs to adhere to and implement the guidelines through its outreach activities. Also, one must add that outreach facilitates an open dialogue on issues of common interest and concern related to nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear export controls. I'm glad to see that Ambassador de Klerk has already addressed the Carter issue. I think it is important that outreach should be the main tool to address the perception of being an elitist group, which lacks transparency. We need to dissolve misunderstandings, and dialogue is vital for the effective and efficient functioning of the regime. I would recall paragraph 17 of the Principles and Objectives for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, adopted at the 1995 NPT REFCON, which called for more openness and transparency in export control. It is important that the group responded substantively to that call at its 1996 NSG plenary in Buenos Aires. Outreach to non-participating governments, transit and transshipment countries multilateral and regional fora, other export control regimes, and industry is one of the main tasks of the chair of the group, as already mentioned. Outreach activities are performed in the Troika format, that is the outgoing, the current, and the incoming chair, which guarantees continuity, institutional memory, and indeed personal contacts. The plenary adopts the outreach agenda and the outreach reports on the outreach activities to the plenary. Other PGs may also contribute to the outreach agenda through their individual contacts and provide technical assistance. I would mention here the European Union's activities in this regard. The JRC has already been mentioned as one of the institutions providing capacity building and technical assistance. Now the second point, the contribution of the Hungarian chairmanship to outreach. What was the starting point of our program? Nuclear supplier group does not exist in a vacuum. The group can only be effective if third-party buyers and suppliers are aware and understand the group positions. We have to deeply anchor outreach in the technical character of the energy, and we have to avoid politicization. The group's work should be perceived as it is, a center of excellence of technical knowledge, which is a public good, from which every third-party actor could benefit. Adherence to the energy lists need to be encouraged and potential misunderstandings need to be dispelled. But let me add that the benefit is mutual. We could learn, and indeed we did learn a lot from our outreach partners' experience in export control and the issues and questions they raised. During our chairmanship, there was a general expectation of a possible nuclear renaissance and a boom in nuclear trade connected to that, somewhat similar to the situation now. The preparations for the 2010 NPT review conference were well underway. And other non-proliferation related developments, let me mention the Aquila Declaration and the signing of the New START Treaty took place. In September 2008, energy participating governments adopted a policy statement on civil nuclear cooperation with the IAEA safeguarded Indian civil nuclear program. The consultations foreseen in that statement needed to be put into practice. The Hungarian chairmanship presented a concept for a framework for outreach, later fine-tuned and annexed to the procedural arrangements. We also used relevant international platforms, such as the IAEA General Conference, the UNGA First Committee 4th Session, and the NPT Review Conference, bilateral consultations, and seminars to reach out for our partners. As for the way forward, if I may, on a personal note, I think active use of international events related to non-proliferation, but also energy and climate change, and the enhanced visibility for the dialogue with academia could be useful. And thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Ambassador Zanetti. And finally, we'll hear from the ambassador from the Czech Republic on the implications for the group from a possible expansion of nuclear energy to address climate change.
Well, thank you, Matt, and it's great to see everybody, to see people who were at the Prague plenary and some other colleagues I haven't seen for a long time. My topic is in a way easier because it's not so technical as for the others, but on the other hand, it's not a topic you can just talk about from the files and archives of the NSG. So I'll start a little bit broadly. Yeah, Georgie?
Yes, I'm lost in somehow in the Zoom empire, but I'm listening, Veronica, I can hear you.
Okay. I believe that nuclear energy is, despite proclaimed departure from nuclear technologies for energy production by some countries, the cheaper and most effective solution for the climate crisis. This will be true at least until humanity manages to develop and operationalize cold fusion or other till now unknown technologies. And since no economy can function without primary source of energy, source that is independent on weather or condition or time of the day, it means that we need other sources, that the so-called clean green sources of energy, who because of laws of physics suffer from natural fluctuations that threaten to overwhelm the grid or cause blackout. These fluctuations can be flattened out by energy from gas or coal that has no future in the context of CO2 emissions. And we don't have sufficient batteries, and they will not be available for quite some time. So we are stuck and will be stuck for the foreseeable future with nuclear energy. Fortunately, also European Commission recognized that and graded for the nuclear energy as a clean energy for the foreseeable future. But classical contemporary nuclear power plant is a very costly investment. The large part of the cost goes on behalf of the safety of the enterprise. And in that sense, we can either in the future increase the power of individual nuclear blocks centralized in few large power plants, and but the other and probably more promising path is to concentrate on creating a net of small modular reactors built close to the place of energy consumption, therefore creating minimal new load for the energy grid. The safety of small modular reactors is already now in line with IAEA standards. As far as security is concerned, the trend is just the opposite. It is much easier to ensure the security of one large site than the security of many small sites. But I'm sure that this problem is something we will be able to solve using new technologies, both on the level of individual reactors and their security systems. We can build on the experience of medical facilities that by large have radiation sources on site and could mitigate the risks very effectively. Well, now coming to the NSG, what does this mean for the NSG? I believe it means NSG has to get ready to the fact that the number of importers of controlled goods might increase significantly if there is a massive buildup of nuclear power plants. It will also need to be ready to update part 1 of the guidelines regularly or more regularly to keep them in line with the new development in nuclear technology. What I was saying about nuclear technology for nuclear energy and nuclear power plants is valid also for nuclear applications in areas as medicine, food industry, agricultural, water. And in line what was said by previous speakers, in this context, we'll need to put more emphasis on outreach and cooperation with adherents. NSG will need to take into account the fact that at least some of the importers will become significant exporters in the future, and not all of them might be NPT states. In this context, I believe a discussion about membership enlargement awaits NSG in the future. Of course, NSG still needs to balance transparency and cooperation with confidentiality and respect for national practices, also as far as it concerns green nuclear area. Thank you for the possibility to address this panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And now I'd just like to ask a question to each of the panelists. Ambassador Laggner, the first panel discussed a bit of the institutional aspects of the NSG, and I'm wondering if you could talk about other, perhaps broader institutional aspects that the NSG will need to grapple with in the coming years.
Well, thank you, Matt. Now, besides the issues of size and membership that I've already addressed, I just want to highlight two issues. One is really ensuring the continuity and predictability of chairmanships. This is very important. We have seen in other regimes, for example, in the MTCR, that there has been a period when it was not possible to identify a chair, and there was an interruption in this continuity of the chairmanship. So one of the issues we might need to discuss is, do we have any fallback mechanism, or can we think about a fallback mechanism if we cannot identify a chair? And linked to this question is also the issue of the support to chairs. Are there possibilities to provide better support to the chairs that might also make it possible for some smaller countries to assume the chairmanship? So continuity of the chairmanship, I think, is an important issue we need to look at. A second issue are the working methods. I think the pandemic has shown us that we also need to rethink some of our working methods. We need to be more open to formats, for example, of conducting certain amount of work in a virtual format. We still meet a lot of resistance in the NSG to do that. We've at least been able to have some online briefings in a virtual format to maintain some momentum. But the working methods also, for example, would include issues such as how can we adapt faster to technological developments? We've heard about some of the technological developments. We also need to remember that there is a certain time lag, which is there for the group to react. We need to find an agreement within the group on how to deal with technological developments, and then they need to be implemented at the national level. So how can we maybe adapt to these faster? I would leave it there.
Okay, thank you. And Ambassador Zanetti, could you speak a bit more to where the NSG fits in the larger non-proliferation architecture?
Thank you very much, Matt. Indeed, I have to admit I'm in a very, very comfortable situation, since many other speakers already touched upon the interlinkage with the non-proliferation regime, and in particular, the NPT. I do agree with Professor Kazuko that the NSG is independent from the NPT. However, we have to see that it is one very important building block in a larger non-proliferation architecture. If I may request Ambassador Laggner to forgive me for referring to the Swiss cheese model of risk reduction, which very clearly describes how the regime, the architecture works. The NSG is a very important and a rather thick slice of cheese in this architecture, however, not the only one. And there may be holes, and then the holes could be covered by other slices of this cheese. So this is how risk reduction in general works, and this works the same way in the non-proliferation architecture. I would not dwell on the relationship between Sanger Committee and the NSG. It has been already described in detail, but I would like to indicate a few examples of the evolution and the interlinkage between the NPT and the NSG, because I'm committed to the importance of the mutually reinforcing character of these institutions. The 1990 NPT Review Conference already has been referred to, which made a number of recommendations indeed, reviewing the implementation of Article 3 and had a significant impact on reactivating the energy activities in the 90s. The full scope safeguards policy was adopted in the energy already in 92. The non-proliferation principle adopted in 94. The 95 NPT Review and Extension Conference endorsed the full scope safeguards policy. The UN Security Council Resolution 1540, I think it is important to mention this resolution in this context, recognized the importance of export controls to non-proliferation efforts. The 2005 Energy Plenary in Oslo adopted additional strengthening measures to establish procedures towards suspending through national decisions nuclear transfers to countries that are non-compliant with their safeguards agreements. The 2010 Action Plan, NPT Action Plan, Action 36, and I quote, the conference encourages states parties to make use of mutually negotiated and agreed guidelines and understandings in developing their own national export controls. And Norway, in 2011, agreed to strengthen its guidelines on the transfer of sensitive enrichment and reprocessing technologies. I think these are good examples of the mutually reinforcing character of those systems. And on a final note, if I may, we have to recall that preparations are underway for the already twice postponed 10th NPT Review Conference. May I join the UN Secretary General's words of caution that the existential threat of nuclear weapons no longer receives or may no longer receive the attention it should. It is welcome that the Vienna Group of 10, in its paper submitted to the PrepCom in Paras 30, welcomed increasing adherence to the understandings of the Sanger Committee and the guidelines of the industry. It is important to spell it out. Personally, I would raise why not to prepare a paper by the group of 48 and submit it. I think the NSG should not shy away from presenting its case as a staunch supporter of the non-proliferation regime and an integral part of it. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. And this will be my last question, so I'll make it a broad one. Veronica, could you give your view on why the NSG matters, or why the group will matter or not in the coming decades?
Well, I think NSG matters and will matter in the future because it's a voluntary regime that participants are willingly exchanging information and cooperating to make the world a safer place and better place. And I think this will be important also in the future. Of course, NSG will need to adapt a bit. It will need to adapt in the area of guidelines because with the quickly developing technology, the guidelines will need to be, I believe, not flexible, but the process of changing the guidelines and lists will need to be a little bit more flexible. Also, for NSG will need to think about participation and about the way how to involve countries that are willing to join and adhere to the principles. On the other hand, of course, to exclude non-proliferators. And also, as others already mentioned, it will need to change or a little bit develop in the way of work, not to do everything in that room in Japanese mission in Vienna, but to be able to work online. But I think for NSG showed the ability to be useful and to develop with developing environment in the past, and I'm sure it'll be able to do so in the future as well.
Thank you. And we're sort of at time, but I'd hate not to ask a question from one of the audience members. I see one on the role of fusion energy, and I'm wondering if any of you would be willing to take a shot at discussing where the NSG is on that in terms of control for either fusion materials, equipment. Have there been discussions in the NSG, or do we think there need to be? Would any of you be willing to take a shot at discussing fusion? Okay, well, maybe we'll need to leave it there. Okay. Well, all right. Well, then I will just close out the event here and thank our second panel as well as our earlier speakers for joining us. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. As I mentioned earlier, the full recording of the event will be available on our website in a few days. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.